Welcome to this session, Immigration in Europe, Balancing Politics, Security and Compassion. Obviously one of the biggest issues in Europe over the last couple of years. You might say over the last 25 years, in fact, but has been particularly acute since the refugee crisis really burst onto the scene midway through 2015. And we have a panel of people with interesting and I think probably rather diverse views on the subject. To my far left, we have Percy Barnevich, I think is the correct pronunciation.
Not ich, Barnevik.
Barnevik, sorry. I should know how to pronounce his name. I used to read it almost every day in the Financial Times. He's was one of the best known businessmen in Europe. Ran ABB, AstraZeneca, Wallander Group, as well as many other organisations. To my immediate left is Begum Doğan, who is chairwoman of the largest media group in Turkey. And to my immediate right is Paul Collier, who is an academic, Oxford professor, but one of those good academics who gets his hands dirty in the public and political realm, often writes for the newspapers, is very engaged in the refugee issue, has been very engaged in particular in Jordan, and has a book coming out about the crisis beginning of next year. And on my far right is Dominic Hangartner, who is another professor, this time at the LSE, runs something called the Immigration Policy Lab, and is from Switzerland, a country that has a lot of immigrants. Right, everybody is going to talk for 5 to 7 minutes, and we might then have a brief conversation amongst ourselves up here, and then we will open it up to you for comments and questions for the last 20 minutes or so. I'm going to ask Begum to go first and tell us about the perspective from Turkey.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be on this panel with all my fellow panelists. I want to start my speech first, hoping that you all had inspirational thoughts and discussions today here at the event. I think we're going through very, very difficult times, and such difficult times requires us to think outside the box. It requires us to question everything and not accept anything at face value, and that requires inspiration. So I wish myself and all of you an inspirational day and an inspirational year to come ahead. On the refugee issue, I want to underline two important things that I believe is very important in how we look at the situation. The first one is I believe Europe needs to snap out of its panic mode. I mean, Europe is a continent of 500 million people, and 1, 2, 3 million refugees is not going to be enough to take Europe away from Europeans. I very much empathize and sympathize with 68-year-old Eastern European who's living on 100 or 150 euro a month pension and probably doesn't trust his local authority or his government to take care of him. I empathize and I understand his fear. But when we are talking about the big strategy, when we are talking about the policies and what we need to do, we cannot give in to the fear. Europe can handle a few million refugees. It's not going to change Europe. So I really believe it is important to look at the big picture. It is important to realize a continent of 500 million is not going to lose everything by a few million. And the second thing I think it's very important to realize is refugees. We're speaking about them like they are numbers, simple numbers. But they are humans. Refugee issue cannot be dealt and left alone to 1, 2, 3 countries to deal with. It's a human issue. It's a humanity issue. And we humans are in one ship altogether. The world is becoming smaller and smaller. So So we cannot think about them as just simple numbers, 1,000 died in the sea today. And we cannot solve this situation with only our minds. We have to bring in our hearts. Empathy and compassion needs to be part of any viable solution. I don't think if we do not feel the pain of the refugees in our heart, we can really come up with a real solution. So I just wish for the humanity to raise above the fear, tap into the wisdom of the heart, and really bring about the best solutions with their minds. I believe we as humans have this capacity. So I really hope we can raise up to it. I think values are very, very important. And we don't talk about them enough. And we don't realize them enough. I really like to call values the hidden heroes of our lives. And this is like it in individuals, and it is like that in companies, and it is like that in nations. In Turkey today, we have 3 million refugees. Only 250,000 of them live in camps. The rest are living among us, normal citizens. And there are villages today in Turkey where the local citizen number is 70,000 and the refugee number is 90,000. So you have to imagine that these local citizens are sharing their municipality services, health services, education services with these people. And of course there are complaints and there are issues about it, but there are no big uprisings, social uprisings. And you know why I think this is the case? Because research shows that in Turkey, almost every citizen, one of top 10, 7 values is helping those in need. Helping those in need is a value that almost all Turkish citizens, I think all humanity has, but in Turkey it's a very remembered value. We live by it, we internalize it. So you don't really see huge uprisings. But this is not to say that this problem should be left to one country, because I don't think it is sustainable, 1, 2, or 3 countries. I think everyone needs to realize that this is a human issue, and maybe one of the first global ones we are facing, but more will come because the world is becoming smaller. The climate refugees we have not seen. Maybe in the next 5, 7 years we're going to have climate refugees. So it is very, very critical. And coming from a media company, I'd like to also outline the importance of media in dealing with these issues. The picture of Aylan baby on the shores of Turkey was taken by one of our women journalists. One of our women journalists. She describes that moment, that when she saw the baby on the shore, that a huge sadness sat on her heart and she was about to crash. And then she thought to herself, no, I have to go and let the story of this boy known by the world. So she gathered herself together, went there, took the picture, and that picture was at the front pages of all newspapers in the world. And maybe it was the most effective call for action. I think it had an impact on policies. It had an impact on how citizens of the world approach this situation. So I really think it's media's responsibility to show the human side of the stories. I also think it's media's responsibility to show the good things and shed light on the good things that are happening as well. For example, in Turkey, 2,000 businesses have been set up by Syrians in the last 2 years. We don't know how many employment this is going to be. Probably not too much to begin with, but still, this is a good piece of news that is worth sharing. I really believe it is very important that we share the responsibility in this big problem, and we all do what is required of us. Realize that the values are very, very important in defining our behavior. So maybe the question to ask is, what are the values in Europe we need to think about? I mean, the terrorists situation in Europe. I need to wrap up? Okay. Okay, for now, this is enough
Okay,
then.
you can come back later.
Yeah.
Yeah. Percy, I'm actually going to ask one of the professors. I don't want to have the business people and then the professors, so you'll be third, all right? I'm going to ask
No, that's okay.
Sir Paul to go next.
I can be number 5.
No, you can't. Sir Paul.
Thanks. I've been working with the Governor of Jordan the last couple of years on the Syrian refugee crisis, together with Alex Betts, who's the director of Oxford's Refugee Studies Centre. And so like Begum, let me start with ethics and values. And refugees, I think, should trigger in everybody a duty of rescue. Refugees fleeing their homes out of fear. Refugees are not migrants. You know, migrants leave their country in hope, hoping to get to California or whatever, opportunity. Refugees are fleeing their country in fear. In fact, for every refugee, there are 2 internally displaced who don't even leave the country, but they're fleeing the same phenomenon. Fear, their homes have become unsafe. So we should always sort of actually start from that phenomenon of displacement, which triggers the duty of rescue. And then the question becomes, what do we need to do to fulfill that duty of rescue? Again, refugees are utterly different from migrants. To fulfill the duty of rescue to refugees, what most refugees want, imagine if you had fled home. What you want is to restore the shreds of normality. And for most people, their basic aspiration is, if possible, go back home. Meanwhile, they've had to flee their homes, and they want as much restoration of normality as possible. And there's one the most fundamental aspect of restoring normality is restoring autonomy and dignity. And that basically means the ability to earn a living. The global refugee system is based on a complete misdiagnosis of what refugees want. It's a hangover from the late 1940s, when refuge was a temporary thing and what people needed was food and shelter for a few months. Now the average refugee is a refugee for years, and 90% of global refugees totally ignore the UNHCR international system. They just bypass it. They do what Begum said, they go to towns. They don't go to the camps. The camps will feed you, will provide shelter. That's not what people want. They're infantilized in the camps. What people want is to earn a living. Now the problem at the moment is that nobody's doing that. It's outside the international system. The international system is focused on feed, house. And so what I've been trying to do with the government of Jordan, and we've come a long way actually, is to build the duty of rescue around the idea of bringing jobs to refugees as near to the havens as possible, as near to the source of the conflict as possible. The majority of the world's refugees, not just Syrian refugees, where it's very obvious, but the majority of the world's refugees live in 10 haven countries. Anybody want to guess the top haven country in the world?
Kenya?
There's a Kenya there. I give this talk around Europe, and the Germans say Germany, the Swedes say Sweden. Top is Pakistan. None of the top 10 haven countries are nice places to be. In fact, all 10 of them are countries of emigration. The one thing they have in common is that they are relatively safe countries in very disturbed regions. And so they're easy to get to. And that is the first and foremost characteristic of a haven if you're fleeing your home out of fear. You want it to be as close as possible. Right? Remember, 2/3 of the people who flee their homes out of fear can't even get across a border. They're internally displaced. Right? So what we've been trying to do with the government of Jordan is bring work to the refugees. First problem is Jordan didn't allow refugees to work. Very sensible, fundamental political reason. Jordanian citizens struggle to get jobs. And so the key breakthrough was to say, let's bring jobs in from Europe, from wherever the international companies could produce stuff in industrial zones in Jordan. For every 100 jobs they create, maybe 70 can go to refugees, 30 can go to Jordanians. Once that was on the table as an offer, the Jordanian government said, okay, we'll do 200,000 work permits on that basis over to Europe. Yeah? And so the key players then become businesses. You know, a lot of you guys, actually. We're shifting the focus of decision out of individual court rooms about is this a refugee or a migrant, from courtrooms to boardrooms. Mm-hmm. What can companies actually do? And in Jordan, it's pretty easy. There's loads of industrial zones, as in Turkey. The whole German business model for the last couple of decades has been shift stages of production to the near offshore. A brilliant new globalization book by Richard Baldwin, which said that is what globalization is now about. Right? So, final hurdle was if you produced in Turkey, which a lot of German firms do, you could sell into Europe without trade restrictions, because Turkey has privileged market access to Europe. Jordan didn't. So we lobbied in the European Commission, and this is the most implausible part of this story. They decided to do something, and so they opened market access for 10 years to Jordan. Right? Final step, we went to the World Bank and said, what are you doing in Jordan? They said, nothing. We can't do anything in Jordan because it's an upper middle income country. So by our rule book, upper middle income countries, no money. We said, there's 1 million refugees there. Oh, we don't do refugees, that's UNHCR. UNHCR only does humanitarian, it doesn't do jobs. Right? Full of anthropologists, it's not. So we've said, why don't you take it to the World Bank's board? And they did, just last month. Right? And the World Bank's board approved a $300 million loan to Jordan to create jobs in the industrial zones. At the same time, it approved a loan for refugees in Lebanon. And the most amazing thing is that is the first refugee loan the World Bank has made in 60 years.
Brilliant.
So that's the story.
Good. We can come back to that later. Really interesting, positive story. Percy, over to you.
Well, since you called me businessman, maybe I should clarify that I stopped that 16 years ago.
Right.
Yeah. Now I have created 2 million small enterprises, 10 million jobs, and 50 million people out of poverty, including in these countries that we discuss here, the source of origin. Now, since I'm a Swedish citizen, I have, of course, followed the influx of hundreds or thousands of people to that relatively small country. Just unaccompanied Afghan youth have been 50,000 in 12 months into Sweden. Quite a strain on the country. Now, there are a number of key issues I think we should address. One is lack of integration of these refugees coming. Some countries have 5% unemployment, like Sweden, but 25% unemployment among the refugees. And that leads, of course, to a lot of support that irritates the remainder of the population. Then we have a lack of solidarity between the EU countries. Some, like Hungary and Croatia, are building fences and walls, like Mr. Trump could come and study. for example. And there's also a rule that those people who come to Europe from one country and then to another country should go back to the first country. Sweden had 50,000 people like that, but when I tried to send them back to country of origin according to Brussels, 0 was received. That's a little sign of how it works. Finally, the most important issue. Stop the refugees in their home countries. Don't let them get to the borders. And to get them out of poverty in Afghanistan, in Somalia, or wherever, cost 10% of the cost of doing it in a European country. They have to learn language, they have to get to school, they have to get living accommodation and all that. That costs 10 times more. So we have to attack the problem in the country of origin. I started now to work with Swedish government, Saudi, Qatar, and also Theresa May here in UK before she became Prime Minister. And we then discussed over the past 2 years what you can achieve. I've got in Sweden $45 million per year over 5 years, and that means that we can lift 3.5 million people out of poverty. There live 33 million in Afghanistan, so that's more than 10% of the population. And also the Emir of Qatar and that extremely wealthy guy, you know, in Saudi, I forgot his name now. They promised anyhow to support their Muslim brothers. They don't receive any refugees, but they were willing to financially help to lift them up in Afghanistan. So that's the important route that most governments are in agreement on. You can also look at Africa. We expect Africa to increase 1 billion more people in the next 25 years. Where? In the poorest and the driest countries. What happens with that explosion comes, you know, and they come over the Mediterranean. We have to attack it now. We have to attack the birth rate. We have to attack, you know, the low living standard. I started, as a matter of fact, already 2.5 years ago with this Berlusconi, Silvio Berlusconi. I wasn't too happy to make an agreement with him, you know, with his banga parties and tax evasion and corruption and all that stuff, you know. But that was a good idea anyhow. So he promised me $35 million if I created 150,000 jobs in Tunisia to keep them out of Lampedusa and Sicily. But then he was fired 2 weeks later, unfortunately. So I have to start over again with Renzi, and he now left the other day. So
you're the kiss of death on Italian people. Just stay out of Italian politics.
Maybe I have to go with that clown that I think will be the new guy now. I don't know. But you can see here, these are clear opportunities. And we receiving countries have to realize that the way to solve the problem is not fences, walls, lamentations, and humanity and all that stuff, you know. It is go to the country of origin, attack it there, bring down the birth rates, bring up the living standard, like I've seen examples of. I've done it myself in the field. We have now 50 million people out of poverty. It can be done. You create jobs, you create enterprises. That's a cheap way to do it. I've been working with that for 16 years now, and now it is very suitably applied to the refugee chaos we've got here. And all the countries I talk to, they are in agreement. And they are willing to pay the money to do it over there. It costs 10%, as I said before. So this is my key point tonight. Right. Attack the problem at the source, at the country of origin.
Right. Thank you, Percy. Final word, initial word anyway, from Dominic.
Thank you. I would like to make a couple of complementary points to the important issues that in particular Percy and Paul raised about attacking the problem at its root, but focus a little bit on Europe and the refugees who did make it to the European shores and who will continue to make it to European shores. And of course it's important not to forget something that Begum mentioned, that the vast majorities of refugees are not living or coming to Europe, but are in many other places. Nevertheless, even despite the about 1.3 million new asylum claims lodged in Europe last year, we see across many European countries, I think, stark signs of integration failures. Low employment rate of asylum seekers and refugees, even those who are accepted, and rising anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiments across certain segments of the population as well. And I would like to spend my time, half of it, on sort of describing a little bit the challenges that I see, but then the other half on how to overcome those challenges. And I do believe that smart policies can play a big role there. And so let me categorize the challenges according to 3 dimensions in sort of descending order of complexity or increasing order of complexity. Let's do it that way. So the easy things first. One simple thing has to do with the sort of legal situation of asylum seekers and refugees by definition. Asylum seekers who come to Europe, if they are from a safe country, they are fairly quickly rejected and, at least in terms of the idea of the Dublin system, sent back to their home country. What that means for those people who are true refugees with consistent asylum claims who deserve asylum in Europe is that their cases are put on the side. For example, Switzerland fast tracks rejections of asylum seekers from Kosovo, rejects those within 48 hours. But what that means is that refugees who can stay in Switzerland or other European countries have to wait on average 1 to 2 years until receiving a positive decision, and in many cases even much longer. And that's true across Europe. So that fast tracking of negative cases leads to very lengthy asylum procedures and long life in legal limbo and real uncertainty if you can stay or not for those refugees who can stay in Europe. And it's easy to imagine that that's on the one hand very difficult psychologically for these people, but of course also discourages them to invest in learning the language, invest in acquiring the skills they need to succeed in their new host countries, right? As with any other form of long-term unemployment, that leads to skill atrophy and makes it very difficult for these people to find gainful employment once they receive a positive decision on their asylum claim. We did a study based on excellent registry data in Switzerland. They're replicating it at the moment in Norway and Sweden. And what we find is for every year, controlling for everything else, for every year waiting longer in legal limbo, the employment rate of these refugees decreased by 4 to 5 percentage points, which is like a 23% decrease at the average, right? So of course, shortening the asylum procedure is not a silver bullet, but every investment that we can make in processing asylum claims quicker will pay off quite dramatically in terms of higher tax revenues from refugees who find gainful employment, and of course lower assistance in terms of welfare. The second thing is kind of related to that, and it goes back to a point that Paul mentioned, which I think is very important, that of course refugee migration is very different from economic or voluntary migration. Now obviously those two things are not as clear cut, or those categories are a little more blurred than our labels, but clearly there are big differences between refugees and voluntary migrants, right? Refugees are often fleeing war, have either that's one of the reasons why they are fleeing, or then experienced in their often difficult journeys to Europe, have experienced some traumas, and all these things together make it very difficult for them to integrate in their new host communities, economically, but also socially and on a civic dimension. And so what we find through a plethora of impact evaluation studies is that even fairly low-cost early assessment interventions, like what are the particular skill sets, but also vulnerabilities of those refugees or asylum seekers who are likely to stay, identify those early on, and then design an integration program, language skills, maybe psychological treatment, maybe integration classes, maybe some additional courses to bring their skill set that is then a better match with the demands of the local labor markets. All these early interventions have dramatically higher payoff if they are done in the first couple of months or first year after arrival, compared to everything else that we do much later in the residency period. So these early interventions, not just in terms of shortening up asylum procedure, but also giving people access to language courses, providing job training, have a fairly high return on investment. The last and arguably most complex issue is that the current political climate across European countries is obviously not very conducive to the integration of immigrants in general and refugees in particular. And based on the understanding that integration is a two-way process, requiring some commitment on the one hand from refugees, but also from the native population and their communities to accept them, I think it's important to study where this anti-asylum seeker, anti-refugee sentiment is coming from. And one thing that we've done over the last couple of months is that we did a huge survey across 15 European countries, coastal countries, countries like Germany or Sweden, which take in a lot of asylum seekers. We surveyed response in countries, including the UK, where they do comparatively less. And what we find is that, yes, most people are not willing to accept more asylum seekers, but, and this is an important caveat, there is a huge, across Europe, a huge problem with the current asylum system. So if we propose to people to redesign the system in a way that each European country takes in its fair share, consistent with maybe some Aristotelian norms of proportional equality, that every country contributes according to its capacity, some function of population size and GDP, then across Europe, even people who are living in countries that would have to take in many more asylum seekers than under the current system of, as Percy described, the country of first entry, these people would be willing to accept more asylum seeker under the assumption that every other European country does the same and shoulders its fair responsibility.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We've got about 20 minutes. I think I just want to get you guys briefly exchanging views. I mean, we've had a sort of a neat distinction in a way between those who have stressed the idea of fulfilling this obligation we have to refugees at distance, at source, and those of you who have, Begum and Dominic, who have stressed more the sort of conventional view in a way that, you know, we have to be compassionate and better organised in the way that we. I have to admit, I think the direction of travel, for all sorts of reasons, partly it's politically and morally more convenient to move in the direction of helping at source, but I think it's also the most hard-headed thing. That being said, there will continue to be, I think, a lot of pressure, you know, at our front door. I think one thing that could help in that is, as you say, I mean, public opinion is sceptical, if not downright hostile, but it's also often quite nuanced. And if again, I mean, as we've seen with the Brexit vote, if people felt they or their governments were in control of the process of selection, I mean, I think one of the problems with the whole system at the moment is that we've set up this enormously hypocritical system. We have these incredibly generous rules, you know, the 1951 Convention, supplemented by the 2004 Humanitarian Protection Directive, and so on and so forth. We now have hugely wide criterion under which people can apply for asylum, and yet they can't get into Europe, or only by making these dangerous journeys and so on. We should be selecting the most vulnerable people. We should be not, in some ways we should be making it hard for people to get here. There should be, I don't know whether we should have camps on the edge of Europe or whatever, where we can select the most vulnerable. I don't know what any of you think about that as an idea. Or anyway, but you may want to come back at each other.
I have a question to my Turkish neighbor here. I personally believe that within 6 months, Mr. Erdogan, with more and more behavior like Putin, will within 6 months open the borders to Greece, and we will have a new surge of people over that part of the Mediterranean.
What makes you think that?
What make me think that?
Yeah.
Well, I know Turkey quite well. I worked there for 40 years, you know.
Begum, do you agree with him?
No, well, I was going to ask that, but right. You asked me, why do I think that? I think that because now EU have decided to cancel the application to Turkey, irritating Erdogan even more. Turkey is thinking about a referendum even, about joining Europe, and there is a massive opinion now increasing in Turkey, where they're not so fond of Europe anymore. But in particular, EU's action is triggering Erdogan. What do you think?
I mean, the truth of the matter is Turkey spent $16 billion on refugees, and Europe did not chip in at all.
No. So what will happen?
We know our president to be, I don't think he's going to open, but he expects Europe to keep its promise, and rightly so. Whether I think he's going to open the doors, I don't think he will.
Pardon?
I don't think he will open the doors.
You don't think so?
I don't think so.
Can we make a bet?
Did-
6 months. I have your card.
So you are pretty sure Europe is not going to keep its part of the promise?
No, you are simplifying things very much, you know.
You are also,
You
by
are.
saying whether we're going to open
No,
the doors
I'm
or
very-
not.
I'm very impartial.
Yes, right.
But I don't like
Anyway.
Mr. Erdogan's
Right.
action recently.
No.
And I really think there's a great
Okay.
risk of
Well,
this will happen.
we don't want to get too deeply embedded in internal Turkish politics, but I mean, what about this whole idea? Can we reform the UNHCR? I mean, Paul Collier's ideas are very radical, but there's a huge international bureaucracy, which international bureaucracies have vested interests. They tend to be pretty immovable. I mean, is the Jordan agreement going to be the first of many?
Oh yeah, I mean, we've already got, it's called the Jordan model now. It's been taken to Ethiopia. They're now talking about it in Kenya. So yeah, I mean, it's the future. And you could either turn UNHCR into an economic agency, which means sack most of its 9,000 anthropologists and lawyers and hire some MBAs who can actually work with business, or you can just shift the task to one of the economic agencies that's already staffed up. I don't mind which is done, right? I just wanted to say, I distinguish Europe's policy, actually, it's glamorizing what Europe did to describe it as policy, but let's be generous and say it was in 3 phases. Phase 1, and Begum is absolutely right, phase 1 I think of as the phase of the heartless head. And that was from 2011 through to 2050. And the haven countries bordering on Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, just bore a massive financial burden by themselves. And Europe, basically, it was the heartless head. It said, it's not our problem, we're not paying. Europe's role then was to form a partnership with the haven countries saying, your job, you're the proximate havens, you provide the physical haven, we will provide the money and the jobs. And we didn't do it. That was the phase of the heartless head. Then, 2015, guess what? We go to the phase of the headless heart. And we open the doors in the most dysfunctional manner you could possibly imagine, because the invitation doesn't come with any means of getting to Europe. And so who goes to Europe? It's the risk takers who are sufficiently affluent to buy a place on one of these leaky boats. Per capita income in Syria before the conflict was $2,000 a year. The cost of a place on a boat was around $6,000 initially. So you can tell who moved to Europe. Yeah? The people who moved to refuge in the regional havens are just a random sample of the Syrian population, because fear struck randomly. Right? The people who moved to Europe are very far from being a random sample of the Syrian population. We estimate that something less than 5% of Syrians are in Europe, but something between 1/3 and 1/2 of all Syrians with university education are now in Europe. They're the very people that Syria will most need in order to rebuild itself, and they're in Europe. So that was the phase of the headless heart. Right? And as you were implying, they can't get jobs in Europe.
Anyway, Paul, we've only got about 15 minutes left.
Right.
I want to just open it up to
Sorry.
comments. No, it was very interesting.
Final phase, we're back to the heartless head.
Right.
Send them back to Turkey.
Right, okay.
I hope
now,
we
if I
manage to combine the two at some point.
Who wants to make a comment or ask a question? There's a gentleman over there. Please say who you are and your organisation.
Yeah, I'm Leopoldo Zambelletti. I work in various biotech organizations, and I'm a trustee of BARTS and the London Charity here in London. But my question was, and I guess a comment to Percy's point, is that you have to take the problem to the country. Maybe one of the gating reasons why this doesn't really happen as fast as one would probably want to see or advocate is the fact that there is a fear that a lot of the investment that gets put into these African countries ends up in the hands of people that don't really redistribute. And so the question to you is, do you think that can you see more of a collaboration on the part of some of the local governments in Africa to make sure that this doesn't really happen? Or do you think that we're still many years away before we see an alternative path, and therefore an investment into African countries without the fear that these investments will go nowhere?
Okay. Well, hold on a sec. Shall we just take perhaps two or three?
Wasn't that a question from him?
Yeah, it's a question for you, but I was just going to ask if we got two or three more. You can answer it in a sec. Anybody else? If not, Percy can answer it now. Over to you.
Okay. I think, if I don't hear so well, but I think you talked about the corruption in governments and people, the money disappears. Let me tell you that we don't work with governments. They are too corrupt, and you can't change it around. So I would say 95% of our work is outside government. You can work outside government. These 50 million people I talked about has not been through government. People talk all the time about work with government. To hell with government. They are too corrupt. I burned my fingers too many times. When I built a power plant in India, I needed 40 signatures, 20 demanded money under the table. Impossible. So therefore we don't work with big projects. We work with sewing machines, small things, where the corruption people can't get it. So it can be done. And I think we can also mobilize America into helping out here. And now Trump, I don't know, but I got a lot of support from Obama and from earlier Bush. I went there every year to the White House. One day I even got a telephone call from Pentagon. And the artillery colonel said to me, Mr. Warnevik, I have a check for you for $2 million for Afghanistan. Oh, I said, that was fantastic. And then I said to him, are you allowed to pay such money from Pentagon? I thought you had to buy tanks and jet fighters. No, what you do is more important than weapons, he said. Oh, that was interesting. And then he said, is this tax deductible in the United States? I thought that was a funny question from Pentagon, because you are the state. You're part of the state. You don't make a tax return. And then he said, okay, then I have to admit, the money comes from Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, who used to be on my board for 10 years. So you have an understanding there. How Trump will behave now, I don't know. But I think in Africa we can count on some American support for this type of action.
Any more points or comments or questions? Well, let me just to come back to the Turkey issue. I mean, the promises that the EU made were partly financial, but they were also to do with visas, visa access to the European Union for Turkish people. And you're saying that neither of these two promises have been fulfilled so far.
Yes.
I mean, are they in the process of being fulfilled? I mean, or has Europe said they're not going to, or we're just in a limbo land?
It's a bit of a limbo land, really.
Right.
I mean, I think on the visa issue, there are some hiccups on the road, and I think that Europe said there it's not going to happen in the calendar. But on the financial one, also, they haven't done anything, and it's in a little bit of a limbo.
Right.
There's no clear time plan as to when they're going to pay it.
And would we expect if Turkey refuses? I mean, Turkey. I mean, the flows have sort of stopped, partly because of or at least through that route has been stopped. Although, so most of the current flows are coming up through Africa and Libya. What are the numbers now, roughly?
About 150,000.
Roughly.
Yeah, 150,000.
150,000 a year. I mean,
Yeah,
they've gone down
yeah.
from 1.3 million. To,
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And how quickly would they pick up again if the Turks stopped doing whatever it is that the Turks are doing? I mean, maybe the kind of flow has sort of come to an end. I mean, everybody with a degree in Syria has got out.
I think what we don't know, and you probably know this better than I do, but there's, even if Turkey lifts the border controls so people move into Greece, nobody wants to go and live in Greece. Sorry, let me rephrase that more politely. There aren't any jobs in Greece. But whether you can walk from Greece to Northern Europe is a different matter. In 2015, you could. In 2017, I don't think you'll be able to.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, let me just add one point to that. We started a large-scale survey in Greece in December 2015, where we, in the port of Lesbos, interviewed people, got their WhatsApp contact details, and that allowed us to stay in touch with them. And so, of those people we enrolled in our survey and interviewed in December 2015, a lot of it made it then into Germany and Sweden and other European countries. When we went back for the second batch in May and early June 2016, a lot of those people, before the EU-Turkey deal was implemented, already went back to Turkey because they couldn't find a job, they couldn't start a life in Greece.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah, yeah.
Hello there, Victoria.
Well, hold on one sec, Victoria.
It's a very quick question. Victoria Stevenson, UNICEF. I'd like to ask our panellists how many of you have been to a Syrian refugee host camp in the last 6 months?
What was her question? I couldn't hear it.
I asked how many of the panellists have been to a Syrian refugee camp in the past 6 months.
Yeah, one. Well, that's pretty good percentage.
I have been.
I heard it.
Oh. You have.
I didn't hear what you said.
She said, "Have you been to a Syrian refugee camp in the
No.
last 6 months?"
No,
No.
not in
But
the last 6 years.
50% of us have been. I mean, I don't count. I'm the moderator, so that's a pretty good hit rate, I would have thought. Any more? I want. I mean, I do think a very Paul Scheffer, who you probably know, the Dutch guy, said, I think very wisely, that we in Europe tend to underestimate our ability to control our borders, partly because of the whole kind of ideology of borderlessness that the modern European Union is partly built on. Schengen didn't really create an external border, at least a rather flaky one. And we hugely overestimate our ability to integrate people into our societies. And I think he's absolutely right about both of those things. Integration happens over generational time, particularly if people are coming from very traditional conservative countries, often Muslim countries. It takes several generations for real integration to take place, however much money you throw at these issues. And it will always create discomfort in regions where large numbers of people from these different countries are settled. So I think we talk far too glibly about integration, which is one of the reasons why I think it's one of the reasons why we have Donald Trump in the White House. To be frank, that the small movements, and this is the point you were saying, and you often hear this: 500 million people in Europe. 1.3 million. I mean, for God's sake, surely we can absorb these people. Well, yes and no. I mean, the cumulative effect of numbers on that scale, okay, it was just 1 year, but if we'd had 1.3 million over year after year after year, these numbers, and this is precisely what happened on the Mexican-US border. It started as a trickle of people in the late 70s. A third of the US population is going to be Hispanic in 20 years' time. This is one of the reasons we have Trump. The other thing about the 500 million is people arriving in Europe, and I agree. I mean, Europe is sort of rich, and you feel it should be more compassionate, but they're not spread out evenly across Europe either. I mean, they're coming to to northwestern Europe. They're coming to Germany and Sweden and places. And you do get very large concentrations very quickly, and and in some way, rich countries are in some ways more sensitive than poorer countries because they have much more developed social infrastructure, which is more easily sort of discombobulated by large movements of people.
But
anyway.
I think, Hispanics is not why Trump won. Why Trump won is because the middle lower income class of America have not increased their purchasing power in the last 10 years, and the government and those in power did not listen and did not hear, and the real conversations did not happen at time, and this is what's happening here as well. I think we very often like to blame something, but not really look at the real problem and start solutions. It's not Latin Americans that are the problems.
Well, we don't want to get into a whole why did Trump win this. The discussion is divided between people who think it's an economic reason and people who think it's a cultural reason. I happen to think it's mainly a cultural reason. The white Americans are now only about 60% of the population, and I think you don't have to be a racist to feel discomfort about losing your traditional majority status as an ethnic group, and I think that is what a lot of Americans have felt discomforted by that. It's not something that gets a kind of it's difficult to express in sort of conventional modern politics, but people have expressed their resentment about it through voting for Donald Trump partly. But anyway, perhaps returning to the role of businesses, Paul. Should this be a sort of central aspect now of CSR, corporate social responsibility for big European companies? Getting businesses in these places in Jordan.
In our last minute, yes, right? CSR. For God's sake, anybody who's involved in a business, what refugees need is not for some company to send a load of blankets. Right? It's to go and do your core job in places that you wouldn't otherwise go to, but will get huge benefit from doing your core job. And that applies to Africa as well. Africa is desperately short of proper firms. If you can bring a proper firm to Africa, it will, as you've done, it will perform the miracle of productivity, bringing scale and specialization that makes ordinary people dramatically better off. That's what modern business you do in your sleep, but you're missing in action in the places that need you most. So CSR needs to be completely redefined. It's not send a blanket, it's do your job in places that you'd otherwise not think of going to.
Well, thank you very much. I think on that note, we will draw the session to a close. Could I just encourage you to provide feedback about this session through your mobile app, if you happen to have one? And I hope you will say something nice about the session. Otherwise, forget it. We want positive feedback. No, we don't. We want honest feedback. We want honest feedback. And there will be a video that will be made available online through the website. But could we all just say thank you to our panelists?